these things, Father, I offer to you through your Son.
Amen. Thank you, Stuart. We're going to be doing Judges 13 through 16 tonight, the Samson story. This is a chart that I've used a couple times. Oh, I should say this first of all. Baptistry is finished and full, and the heater is functional. So teach all your friends. We're ready to use it. It's time to get that thing going. We've been using this chart where the very first part of Judges starts at the top. It mirrors the last section of Judges. We did 2 introductions with Judges. So the very first introduction was military decline, and the second introduction was religious decline. And then in the bottom, we've got 2 classes left after this, and we're going to match those. We're going to do, this is what you can do to get ready for class next week. Chapters 17 and 18, we'll be looking at religious decline. So it starts with military, goes to religious. It starts, the first conclusion is religious decline, so you're going to be looking for that when you read. And then the last conclusion is military decline. And then you've got these different judges, and it's a downward spiral. Things get worse and worse, but they match. And so one of the things that we'll be doing tonight is comparing the Samson story with the Othniel story. How do these 2 judges compare? And I would suggest to you, and I'll try and make the case for this, that they're intentionally, that the Judges is intentionally laid out in this way specifically to contrast these things. And so before I just start with my list, would you like to start and say, based upon, what you know from Othniel, this is what we saw with Othniel's story, and this is what I see how it contrasts with Samson's story. Anything that you want to point out there before we get going? I'll give you the first shot. All right, well, let's do this then. Stick your marker in Judges chapter 13, because that's where we're studying from tonight. And then go over to Judges chapter 1. I've already said a lot of this in our very first class. I guess I'll throw this up here for you too. This is our first major contrast that we see. In Judges chapter 1, starting in verse 1, it says, "After the death of Joshua, the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? And the Lord said, Judah shall go up." So Judah is the first mention. We've said this many times. Judah is ideal. They do what they're supposed to do. They're leaders of God's people. They encourage family cooperation. Everything is good about what Judah does here. And then our first judge, we're introduced to our first judge in, I guess verse 12, but verse 13 is what I'm looking at specifically. It says, "Othniel the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother." Caleb is from the tribe of Judah. And you can find that from the Numbers account where, remember when Moses sent out the 12 spies into the land, and Joshua and Caleb were the 2 spies who came back with a faithful report, and Joshua's from the tribe of Ephraim and Caleb is from the tribe of Judah. So we start with Judah, and our first judge, Othniel, is associated with Judah. And then at the end of chapter 1, at the very bottom of the spiral, it says the Amorites pressed the people of Dan back into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down to the plain. So Dan is the bottom of the spiral here in military defeat. And there's nothing redemptive about them whatsoever. And they don't, God said to Dan, this is your allotment in the land, but they never took it. There's not a tribe of Dan in the Old Testament. There's what God said should have been the tribe of Dan, but they never actually got the land. And we'll be seeing that in our next class, where the people of Dan are just wandering around Israel looking for a place to stay until they go to the very far northern tip and they found the city of Dan. Anybody want to take a guess what tribe Samson is from? Come on. Dan. In chapter 13 and verse 2, it's where we start with Samson's family and his story. There was a certain man of Zorah of the tribe of the Danites, whose name was Manoah. And so, we've seen in the table of contents, it starts with Judah, it ends with Dan. It's really bad. We started with the first judge in Judah, and now we're ending with Dan, and we should not be expecting to see very much good out of this story. That's basically what we've set up. Anything you want to say about that? With this layout? Okay. All right then. So, one of the things that we talked about with Othniel's story was this family faithfulness. We think about Othniel, we think about Caleb especially. Caleb was one of the 12 spies, one of two who was faithful and said, no, God is with us. We can take the land. And in verse 13, chapter 1, and starting in verse 12, Caleb, this faithful man, said, he who attacks Kiriath-Sepher and captures it, I will give him Achsah, my daughter, for a wife. And Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, captured it. So you've got this family of Jewish people, and it's a faithful Jewish family, and they're together, and everybody is what they're supposed to be. And one of the main problems in the book of Judges it pops up here in chapter 3 in verses 5 and 6. So the people of Israel lived among the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, and their daughters they took to themselves for wives, and their own daughters they gave to their sons, and they served their gods. How does that contrast with Samson's story? What did you see in Samson's story? You can talk this time. No. Mark's going to pout and not want to know. Let me move this over so I can stand in Mark's business. Let's start in chapter 14 and verse 1. This might be hard because the city names are foreign to us, and we might not recognize them as foreign cities, but some of these things ought to be pretty clear. 14 and verse 1. Samson went down to Timnah, and at Timnah he saw one of the daughters of the Philistines. Then he came up and told his father and mother, I saw one of the daughters of the Philistines at Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife. But his father and mother said to him, is there not a woman among the daughters of your relatives or among all the people that you must go and take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? But Samson said to his father, get her for me, for she is right in my own eyes. And so, we've seen the picture of ideal Othniel and family faithfulness. And now Samson is doing this thing that he should not be doing. In chapter 16 and verse 4, there's another one. And this is the third one. There's a second one in chapter 16 and verse 1. We'll talk about that in a second. Samson went to Gaza. Gaza is one of the 5 main cities of Philistia. And there he saw a prostitute, and he went into her. And then in verse 4, after this, he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, again, another area of Philistines, whose name is Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said, seduce him and see where his great strength lies. And so, where are you seeing with this? What's the contrast here between Judah and Othniel and Dan and Samson? The top of the spiral and the bottom of the spiral. Yeah. Yeah. At least we could give him this. In chapter 14 and in verse 4, we stopped reading right about 4. It says, his father and mother did not know that it was from the Lord, for he, the Lord, was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. At that time, the Philistines ruled over Israel. The one redeeming thing that we could say about this is that at least God is using these bad choices for his purposes, but there's nothing good about this. This is not what it's supposed to be. And one of the things that I would really ask you to start seeing with not just Samson, but with all the judges, but especially with Samson right now, is that Samson and this judge is a picture of Israel. And Israel has been unfaithful in what God told them to do and what God told them to be. And Samson here is doing that. He's a picture of Israel's unfaithfulness. Anything you want to say about that one? Family faithfulness falls apart. Oh, Michael, yeah.
Kind of going along with family, between Samson and Othniel, it's like, one, their choice of women, Othniel, chose someone from their family, chose a good Israelite woman. Samson was going against, what the Philistines want foreigners, but also, Othniel, he went and fought to earn his wife, he went out and did what he was supposed to do, and Samson came back to his parents and was like, I want that one, go get her for me.
Yeah.
He wasn't willing to put any work in it.
Yeah.
He wasn't willing to go do anything.
Yeah. And I think your point, you make a great point, and I think your point is even bigger and better than you probably realize it at this stage. Or maybe you do, and you're just keeping it short, but you're right. You hit the nail right on the head with that. And that's the next thing that I want to talk about. But anything else here about these two? I hope that you're seeing, in each of these things, there's a lot of practical stuff for us, and what God called Israel to be, and what Israel is not, and what Samson is not. Let me see. I want to make sure I don't skip over any of the notes here that I wanted to say. Let's talk about Michael's point. This is the third one. I know that I read this just a second ago, but it's one of my favorite points in the entire Bible, especially about relationship stuff. Chapter 1 and verse 12, Caleb said, he who attacks Kiriath Sefer and captures it, I will give him Achsah, my daughter, for a wife. And Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, captured it. And he gave him Achsah, his daughter, for a wife. Achsah was a treasure worth fighting for. Caleb, this faithful leader, hero of God's people, says, if you do this task, this monumental task, and catch the city of giants, you can marry my daughter. And Othniel's like strapping on his sword. I'm going to go do it. So I say it like this, that Achsah is a treasure worth fighting for. For Samson, over and over and over again, women are objects to be used and thrown away. And this is the point I think that Michael was making just a second. But let's keep reading here. In chapter 14, he read about his first Philistine wife, and And it's what Michael said, starting in verse 3, I guess ending in verse 3. Samson's rationale, get her, for she's right in my eyes. The New American Standard Version says, she looks good to me. You know, this is the kind of person that he is here. And verse 5. Then Samson went down with his father and mother to Timnah, and they came to the vineyards of Timnah, and behold, a young lion, let's skip that. Verse 7. He went down and talked with the woman, and she was right in Samson's eyes. After some days, he returned to take her. And he turned aside. He eats the honey out of the dead lion. We'll talk about this just in a second. Verse 10. His father went down to the woman, and Samson prepared a feast there, for so the young men used to do. As soon as the people saw him, they brought 30 companions. The woman tells the riddle so that Samson has to pay this price. And Samson gets mad about it in verse 19. The Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and he went down to Ashkelon and struck down 30 men of the town and took their spoil and gave the garments to the men who had told the riddle in hot anger. And he went back to his father's house. Now look at this. This is where it starts, verse 20. And Samson's wife was given to his companion who had been his best man. So Samson says, get her for me. She looks good to me. He gets mad at her and just takes off so that her dad gives her away to someone else. And then in verse 15, after some days, at the time of wheat harvest, Samson went to visit his wife with a young goat. I don't know if this is intentional, if this is like a standard price in the day, but I've got a note here in my Bible next to this to remind me of this. Do you remember when Tamar pretended to be a prostitute for Judah? And she said that her price as a prostitute was a young goat. So Samson goes to his wife, who he's discarded, who's been given to someone else, and he says, here's a goat. In verse 1, I will go into my wife in the chamber. But her father wouldn't let him go in. And, you know, I know this is uncomfortable to talk about. It is for me anyway, uncomfortable to talk about. But here is a guy who, I mean, she's nothing for him but an object to be used and discarded when he's finished. And if you have any more questions about that, chapter 16 and verse 1, Samson went to Gaza, and there he saw a prostitute, and he went into her. So not only does he just use and discard his first wife, I use that word, I mean, kind of loosely, the way that he treats her. He uses her, discards her, goes back to her. Then he finds a prostitute. Then in verse 4 of chapter 16, after this he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. And sometimes you'll hear people say, now this one is real. Samson loved a woman. And I would say, Samson's problem the whole time is that he loves women. That's been his problem. And so I'll stop talking. I've got a lot to say on this subject, but I'll let you make your points. But, you know, we've seen a lot of women in Judges. There are more women as characters in Judges than any other book of the Bible, and it's not accidental. And oftentimes the women are Aksa, who is a treasure worth fighting for, and Deborah, who is awesome, a hero in her own right, and Jael, who's awesome, and the unnamed woman who killed Abimelech, a terrible leader of Israel. You've got all of these women in Judges who are doing good things, and Samson just, I don't know. Maybe I don't know. What's your comment here? Two things that I would say about it, but what's your comment? Yeah, Chad?
This is not a comment to your open question. I guess I haven't noticed this. I mean, I'm in NIV, and maybe NIV just takes a more PG approach. But in verse 1, it talks about Samson took a young goat to visit his wife, and he said, I'm going
Yeah, I don't think so.
But her father wouldn't let him.
Room. Maybe is how we would do that. Yeah. No, I don't think so. I mean, maybe, yeah, I'll go into my wife's room and we know what's going to happen in the room. But, yeah, I can feel my face just turning as red as Nathan's shirt back there. I don't like to talk about these things. I mean, it's in the Bible. I know we have to talk about it. But Michael, you had something, and then we'll go to Nathan.
But speaking about this, like, at the beginning of this class, is always judges wherever the man gone. And I think it also shows not only a failure of like male leadership, like the downward spiral of male leadership, but it also shows the importance of who leading men have as companions. We see here the importance of the guys that were good leading. They had good women following with them, and as it went down, the women went downhill with them. But then also taking that to like a modern day, with elders and deacons, it doesn't matter about just the guy. There's qualifications for the men and women.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it shows, good family structures, good marriages do great things for, not just individuals, but for a nation in general.
Yeah, that's going to be, I mean, my very first point that I make here is just, I think if you want to see decline among God's people, decline in religion, but decline in society in general, is men having this view towards women that there are things to be used. But more than that, I think what we're seeing here is that the building block of faithfulness and Israelite stability is marriage, and godly marriage, faithful families. And at the very end, one of the worst stories, I might even go so far, besides Jesus dying on the cross, to say the worst story in all of the Bible at the end of the book is a story about a woman who is victimized by a man who should have known better. It's a major theme that we should really, really pay attention to, pay a lot of attention to this, because it's something we need to be thinking about. Nathan, did you have? I can't hear you. I'm sorry, Nathan.
No, he's talking about the PG version of the verse 1, verse 16.
15.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
But but I think of the previous instances with Samson, those were more in lust, not in love. But because in here, we're fully like in love for the first time, and that the woman is named, I guess, according to this is the Tanakh translation, but this indicates that this time Samson was emotionally involved and was bound to behave differently. That's the first time it's mentioned, but the other time, I think what you're saying is great. I think it looks like he's changed his emotional behavior, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know how. I sent you that article to try and provide another perspective on Samson in the Friday email last week, but I have a really hard time saying very many good things about Samson. Was there any other comments on that one? We'll keep pushing forward here. I think that this is maybe just, I know that this is a uncomfortable thing to talk about here, but there's all kinds of things in the Bible. This is for men. I'm talking mostly to men. It applies to everybody, but I'm talking mostly for men here. There's all kinds of places in the Bible that talk about sexual immorality, and we know what's right and what's wrong, and we know what we shouldn't be doing. But this, to me, in all of the Scripture, is the best way to convince yourself or to convince anybody that you know among God's people that pornography is an evil that needs to be eradicated across the board. And if you feel the pull and feel the temptation to go that way, the thing that you might think about in your head is, do I want to be a Samson? Somebody who uses women and when I'm finished, discards them and throws them away. Because that's exactly what Samson is. And I know that none of the men in this room want to be that. It's I think worth considering. Don't be the guy who himself or is okay with using women for my own personal gain and then throwing them away. That's not okay. Anything there? The next thing is family cooperation. Aksa says, hey, ask my dad for a field. We got this land in the promised land. Let's have more. Let's have all the blessings of the promised land. Let's have all of this great stuff. And she goes, and her and Othniel, and she asks her father, and her father gives her this land. And it's a family that works and functions in the way that it's supposed to. And it's really something that, it's just a couple of verses, but it's something to envy. You look at this family, and I think, I want a family that works like this. This is good stuff. And Samson, in chapter 13, we skipped over the story, but you have this story of Manoah and his wife talks to an angel, and she says, hey, an angel told me that we're going to have a son, and he's going to be a Nazarite. And the dad doesn't believe her, says, I need to hear it myself, and she leads him back. And he says to the angel, what did you say to my wife? And he says, ask your wife. I told your wife what to say. And, we start with Samson's, I think, weak father. He says, get that woman for me. She looks good. And he says, son, we see these parents all around us. Son, maybe we shouldn't do that. And he says, get her for me. And, okay. That's pathetic. I mean, it's pathetic, the kind of parents that Samson has here. There's no way that they should have done this thing. And then Samson discards his wife. In chapter 15, he goes back with a goat and says, hey, I want to use my wife again. But her father would not allow him to go in. And her father said, I really thought that you utterly hated her, so I gave her to the companion. And here's her young sister. And Samson said, this time I will be innocent in regard to the Philistines when I do them harm. So Samson went and caught 300 foxes, and he burned all of their food down. I mean, if there has ever been a picture of dysfunctional family, this is it. And Samson is attached to all of these things. He uses a prostitute. In family cooperation, Aksa built Othniel up. Both of Samson's women, the woman in chapter 14 and Delilah in chapter 16, both of them actively work to destroy their husband. They're not raising him up and encouraging him to be the best he can be. They're working against him to try and bring him down and destroy him. And so family cooperation has been a theme all the way through Judges. And I think that what we need to see here in Samson's story is that, it's all falling apart. Anything you want to say about that? Any other examples of it? Or any comments about the lack of family cooperation here? Jonathan, yeah?
Stephen Chetlat says, was eating honey from a lion a violation of the Nazarite vow?
Yeah. Who said that?
Stephen Chetlat.
Yeah. Steve, give me 1 second on that. And I'll do that one. Yeah, that's right. I think so. Yeah, but I want to make a point about it. Good. Thanks, Jonathan, for passing that on. Another comment about family cooperation? So here's what we're doing with all of this. What do we want? What do we want in my own home? Ryan, Becky, Luke, Lily, and Olivia. What do I want in my house? What do we want in our church family? And to the extent that this is possible, what are we going to strive for in the bigger world around us? We want victory. We want cooperation. We want faithfulness. We want solid biblical marriage that's functional and that works, and families that work. This is the stuff that we need to be thinking about. And the more that we've seen the decline of these things in our society, the more we see, our own country in decline in every way.
A lot of the dialogue between Samson's wives and Samson, there's a lot of manipulation.
Oh, yeah.
It's just like in 14 and verse 16, Samson's
I'm going to cry. And she cried all week until she got her way. There's a million, maybe not a million, but at least 100,000 examples of brokenness in this story, and it's worth studying. Okay, next point that I have up there. Othniel is someone, I don't know how to say this, and I would appreciate if you would help me to think of a better way to say this story, but I say with Othniel, as the ideal judge, he's someone who got it done. My favorite verse, maybe in the Bible, but in the book of Judges for sure. And the Spirit of the Lord was on him, and his hand prevailed. Here is a guy who was what he was supposed to be and did what he was supposed to do. It's awesome. Wouldn't that be cool? I know it sounds like I think about death all the time. I talk about when I die. I'm not making any plans. I'm just saying that wouldn't it be cool if that's what was written on your headstone? The Spirit of the Lord was upon him and his hand prevailed. That would be a good thing to say about somebody in their life. Samson, though, Steve's question, there's a huge section in here about Samson is going to be a Nazarite from birth. Chapter 13 and verse 4. Therefore, be careful. Drink no wine, no strong drink. Eat nothing unclean. For behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. No razor shall come upon your head, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb. It's worth writing in the margin of your Bible there, Numbers chapter 6 and verses 1 through 6. This is where you find the biblical law of a Nazarite, and we're not going to take the time to read that now. But in chapter 6, there are 3 things that a Nazarite does. Number 1, no alcohol. No wine or strong drink. You're set apart for the God's work. No alcohol. In verse 5, no razor shall touch his head. In verse 6, it says, all the days that he separates himself to the Lord, he shall not go near a dead body. Not even for his father or his mother, or his brother or sister if they die. He'll make himself unclean because of his separation to God in his head. So this is like a picture of Israel. Samson is called from birth to be set apart. And I'm sure that there's probably more of these in here. But starting in chapter 14 and verse 5, we have the story about how he kills a lion with his bare hands. And you're like, well, I mean, what's the alternative? I mean, the lion could have ate him. Okay, fine, I'll give you that one. But then in verse 8, the story is he's walking past the dead lion and he says, hey, bees have made honey inside of it. Sticks his hand in the dead lion and eats the honey that came out of its carcass. If there is a picture of contact with death and uncleanness in the Bible, that's it. I mean, we're not even Jewish people and it's gross. You know, it's not okay. He's not supposed to have any contact with alcohol. In verse 10, 14:10, his father went down to the woman, and Samson prepared a feast there, for so the young men used to do. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to think about what's going on at this wedding feast. But here's what happens if you look at that word feast. Mark, you got your ESV study Bible? In the ESV study Bible, the note next to that word says, this word denotes a feast that especially includes alcohol. Here is the dictionary biblical language. This word is a meal, a feast, a banquet, an eating event, either as common meal or usually as a special festive dinner, often including much drinking of wine. The word feast that Samson throws down here is a word that includes the idea of a drunken party. Later on, in chapter 15 and verse 15, what does he kill a bunch of people with? It's not just the jawbone of a donkey, it's the fresh jawbone of the donkey. This thing has still got the meat on it. More contact with death. And the very pinnacle of Samson's story is that his hair gets cut and he loses his power. And so contrast, Othniel was a guy, the Spirit of the Lord was upon him and his hand prevailed. He got it done. He did what he was supposed to do. Versus Samson, who all throughout the story is pictured as somebody who is supposed to be set apart for God's service, who violates his Nazarite vow on every page of the story. So yes, Steve, I think the eating honey out of a dead lion is a violation of the Nazarite vow. Yeah, Mark?
Chapter 13 and verse 7. It says that the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb to the day of his death. So, are you still a Nazarite, even though you've broken the Nazarite vow so many different times?
Yeah. I love that you asked that question, because if Samson is a picture of Israel, at this point in the book, is Israel really God's people if they've broken their covenant with him so many times? I mean, that's the point. That's what this story is about. Multiple women, multiple failures, multiple turning away from God. Yeah, I don't know the answer to your question, but I think your point is the right question to ask.
So it was at number 6, right? Where,
What's that? Number 6 is the Nazarite command.
so in that, does it ever talk about if becoming a Nazarite is a person's choice, or if it's never inherited?
I think this is the one place in the Bible where it is supposed to be the person's choice in number 6. But God calls him in the same way that he called Israel to be set apart for God's service for life. Yeah, another good catch. Others comments about that? I'm sorry that I've been talking so much lately in this class. I'll take a breath here. What about heritage and legacy? Othniel, the story ends with, and the land had rest for 40 years. We haven't seen rest at the end of a judge's story for a while now. Gideon created a bad son, Abimelech. Gideon's fear and wavering on God created a not faithful family. Jephthah specifically destroyed his family, and there's no mention of family in Samson's story whatsoever. He doesn't care about family. He just goes around from woman to woman to get whatever he wants. And so, one of our things that I think is worth asking in this story is not just Othniel led to 40 years of rest for the land and Samson didn't. Had no legacy, no heritage, no rest for the land. One question that I hope we ask ourselves is, what are you going to leave behind? I look at Jude here, and I call him Gino in my house. And it just happens that I'm going to say Gino. I look at Gino. I hope that you look at your babies. Jude'll sitting there looking at me. I hope that you look at your babies and you're like, I'm going to raise this child to be the Lord's and hopefully to be a gift to the world, a heritage and a legacy that I leave behind, and not a curse like Abimelech. So that's really the end. I got a summary point to make here, but do you have any last words about the Samson story and what you see in the Samson story? Let's do Michael and then Jonathan.
After I was talking about the Tower of Babel yesterday and how the people were becoming selfish, and that's when, everything went bad there and God came down, and they were talking about ourselves. And throughout the book of Judges, you can kind of see, like, with Gideon, the setting it went from, instead of being for God, is for God and for Gideon. Then it's just a downward spiral of being selfish and more self and less of God. And it kind of seems like that could have been like one of the underlying things with what caused their downfalls. They went from serving God to serving themselves.
Yeah. Remember with the study of Jephthah, one of the main 3 things that we talked about with Jephthah was self-interest in each of his 5 stories. It's a good catch. Jonathan?
Nick Weaver commented, since Samson is such a bad character, why is he mentioned as an example of great faith in Hebrews 11:33?
So, in the end of his story, this is the same thing that I would say about each of these people. At the end of chapter 16, in verse 28, Samson called to the Lord and said, "O Lord God, please remember me and please strengthen me only this once, O God, that I may be avenged." He's thinking of himself there. "That I may be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." And Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested, and he leaned his weight against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other. And Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." And he bowed with all his strength, and the house fell upon the lords and upon all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed in his death were more than those whom he killed in his life. That's a noteworthy thing. It's a noteworthy thing to say, God, I know that you are capable of strengthening me to accomplish this task. And on this occasion, he gave his life to do it. I can take that example to say, okay, will I cast myself upon the Lord in this exact same way that Israel said, God, would you save us? And they walked through the Red Sea. They didn't get to enter the promised land because they weren't faithful till death, but that act of faithfulness is noteworthy. Samson at least demonstrated a noteworthy act of faith that's worth thinking about, if not replicating. That's the way that I would answer it. I know that's a tough question. I mean, Samson's name is listed in Hebrews 11, and that's hard. And I'll tell you just honestly, I don't think that I have a satisfactory answer for that. So here's what we're going for. No weak dads. Let's inspire and work towards functional families that cooperate and work together. Communication is a major problem. How many times in Samson's story do you see, but he did not tell his mother and father? Communication within marriage, within the home. Good family relationships, not bad family relationships, even with in-laws. No selfish pursuit of our own personal interest, but working for the good of our family and for the good of something bigger than ourselves. A sense of commitment. Women are more than just things to be used and thrown away. Think about the heritage and the legacy that we're going to leave behind. And ultimately strive to provide a sense of rest in the Lord in the land and not curse. These are all things that I think would be really good for us to be considering. If you want to find a goal, these are good goals. All right. Thanks for your participation tonight in class. Next week, we're going to do the first conclusion, which is 17 and 18. So read through 17 and 18 and look for religious failure. I'll come to class and I'll say, where do you see religious failure?